This is the case of a patient with ischemic cardiomyopathy implanted with a dual lead ICD, and this is an episode of conducted atrial fibrillation. The plot is characteristic with a very fast and irregular atrial rhythm, irregular ventricular rhythm also with cycles classified VS, VT, and a few ones are classified VF. This plot highlights the major interests of the VT counter to discriminate the atrial fibrillation, since you need to remember that every cycle classified VS, so outside the VT zone, will reset the VT counter to 0. Here you see that there is a stabilization of the ventricular rhythm inside the VT zone, but no therapy is delivered since there has been a diagnosis of atrial fibrillation through the PR logic algorithm. When you look at the EGM now, you can see that it is a typical episode of conducted atrial fibrillation with very fast cycles at the level of the atria and irregular and fast cycles at the level of the ventricles. 4 conditions are required for detection of an episode of conducted atrial fibrillation with the PR logic. So first, the AF evidence counter analysis will determine that an atrial tachyarrhythmia is present if the counter reaches a predefined threshold. So the AF evidence counter needs to be of more than 6 at the time of the diagnosis, and this counter increases by 1 every time 2 atrial events or more are observed between 2 ventricles. So like here, if between 2 ventricles there are at least 2 atrial events, 2 or more, then the counter increases by 1, and there is a possible diagnosis of atrial fibrillation if at the time of the diagnosis this counter is at least at 6. The second step will be to determine that there is no far-field R-wave oversensing at the level of the atrial, and the idea here is to determine that the signals that are sensed at the atrial levels are real and really correspond to fast atrial signals. So the device will search for characteristic sequences and repetitive sequences of short, long signals at the level of the atria in favor of far-field R-wave sensing. This is clearly not the case in this patient with a random apparition of very fast atrial signals. The third step will be a comparison between the atrial rhythm and the ventricular rhythm, and the atrial rate must be faster than the ventricular rate with a median atrial interval less than 94% of the median ventricular interval, and this is clearly the case in this patient. So the last step to arrive to the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation, conducted atrial fibrillation, will be the differentiation between conducted AF and dual tachycardia, so VT plus atrial fibrillation. And this is going to be based on the analysis of the ventricular regularity. The way it is analyzed is completely different than for a single lead ICD, and it's going to be based on an analysis of the regularity of the last 18 ventricular cycles. If the regularity is less than 50%, then the diagnosis is going to be conducted atrial fibrillation, like in this patient. So to summarize, there are different steps. The first one, remember the VT counter. Every time there is a cycle classified VS, then the VT counter is reset to 0. Then there is a stabilization in the VT zone and the VF zone. Once the VT counter is full, you arrive to the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation through 4 different steps. First, diagnosis of very fast atrial rhythm, no far-field R-wave sensing, and ventricular irregular rhythm in favor of a conducted atrial fibrillation.